There are moments when everything you believe to be solid shatters like crystal against concrete. And for Marcus Chen, that moment arrived on a Thursday evening in late September when the air carried that peculiar crispness that makes New Yorkers remember why they endure the chaos of the city. He stood in the executive conference room on the 42nd floor of Rothman & Associates, his reflection ghosted in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, and he felt the ground beneath his carefully constructed life beginning to crack. Marcus had worked at Rothman & Associates for 12 years, climbing from junior analyst to senior partner through brutal work ethic and an almost supernatural ability to read market trends before they materialized, and in that time, he had made the firm, and more specifically, his mentor William Rothman, hundreds of millions of dollars. He had sacrificed relationships, his health, entire years of his life to prove himself worthy of the trust William had placed in him when he'd plucked Marcus from obscurity at Columbia Business School. The conference room whispered wealth, mahogany table polish to mirror finish, Italian leather chairs, abstract art that cost more than most people's homes. William Rothman sat at the head, silver hair perfectly coiffed, his Tom Ford suit fitting his athletic 60-year-old frame with surgical precision, and his expression carried that practiced neutrality that powerful men deploy when they're about to destroy someone's life while appearing reasonable. Flanking William were the firm's other senior partners, Jonathan Mercer, whose family money had bought his seat despite mediocre abilities, Patricia Vanderbilt, whose cold ambition had earned her a reputation as the industry's most ruthless negotiator, and standing slightly apart, wearing an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, was his closest friend of the firm, Daniel Park, the man who had been his confidant, his ally, the person he'd trusted with everything. William cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. Marcus, this conversation is one of the most difficult I've had in my 30 years running this firm, he began, his hands folded with rehearsed regret, and I want you to understand that everything you've contributed is valued, but we find ourselves in an untenable situation that requires immediate action. Marcus felt ice water pouring through his veins. What situation? Patricia Vanderbilt leaned forward, sliding a manila folder across the table, the soft whisper of paper against wood somehow ominous. We've uncovered evidence of unauthorized trades made using firm resources, trades that exposed Rothman & Associates to significant liability, and unfortunately, Marcus, all of these trades were executed through your credentials, from your terminals, during hours when only you had access to the systems. The folder contained printouts of trading records, account statements, transaction logs, and as Marcus's brilliant mind parsed the documents, he immediately recognized what he was looking at and, more importantly, what he was being accused of. These were aggressive, highly leveraged positions in volatile emerging markets, the kind forbidden by the firm's risk protocols, and they had all been made over the past 6 months using his security credentials, during late-night hours when digital surveillance would show only him present. The problem, the absolutely terrifying problem, was that he had never made these trades, had never seen these accounts, had never authorized anything remotely resembling what was documented across the pages before him. "This is impossible," Marcus said, hearing desperation creep into his voice despite his efforts at control. "I didn't make these trades. I've never accessed these accounts. Someone has used my credentials." He stopped, seeing their expressions, the way William's eyes had gone flat and distant, the way Patricia's lips curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. William raised a hand, simultaneously dismissive and patronizing. "Marcus, I understand this is shocking, but we've conducted a thorough investigation with our cybersecurity team, and the evidence is conclusive. These trades were executed using your unique security tokens from your personal terminal during times when security footage shows you alone in the office." The accusation was so absurd, so completely fabricated, that Marcus almost laughed, except he suddenly understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a carefully orchestrated hit, a professional demolition, and the people executing it had every intention of making it stick. He looked around the table, his gaze finally settling on Daniel, his friend, his ally, the man who had stood as best man at his wedding, and he saw in Daniel's carefully neutral expression something that made his stomach drop. Guilt, yes, but also resolution, the look of someone who had made a choice and was committed to seeing it through. "Daniel," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know this isn't true. You know I would never." But Daniel cut him off, his voice steady and apologetic in a way that felt practiced. "Marcus, I'm sorry, but I was the one who first noticed the irregularities, and when I brought them to William's attention, we had no choice but to investigate, and the evidence speaks for itself." In that moment, Marcus understood the full scope of the betrayal. Daniel wasn't just failing to defend him. Daniel was actively participating in his destruction, had likely been the architect, had used their friendship and his intimate knowledge of Marcus's work patterns to construct a frame so perfect it would be nearly impossible to disprove. William stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. "Effective immediately, your partnership is terminated, your access to all firm resources is revoked, and we will be referring this matter to the SEC and potentially to federal prosecutors," he said, false regret coating every word. "We'll need your security badge, your laptop, your phone, and building security will escort you out." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of humiliation, the cold efficiency of security guards, the long walk through the office where colleagues suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact, the ritual surrender of his badge and devices that felt like being stripped of his identity piece by piece, and finally, the ride down in the service elevator, not even granted the dignity of using the main elevators, descending 42 floors with 2 silent guards flanking him. When they deposited him on the street, early evening foot traffic flowing around him like water around stone, Marcus stood for a long moment looking up at the building that had been the center of his professional life for 12 years, and he felt something shifting inside him, something fundamental changing. The initial shock was giving way to something else. Not yet rage, but a cold, calculating fury that settled into his bones and began analyzing the situation with the same strategic brilliance that had made him one of Wall Street's most successful traders. He took out his personal phone and called his wife, Sarah, a pediatric surgeon at Mount Sinai, probably just finishing her shift. When she answered, her voice bright with anticipation of their dinner reservation, he found himself unable to speak for a moment, the reality of what he needed to tell her suddenly overwhelming. "Sarah," he finally managed, his voice rough, "something's happened, something bad. I need to come home and explain everything, but I need you to know right now that I didn't do what they're going to say I did, and I need you to believe me, to trust me, even though what's about to happen is going to test that trust in ways we never imagined." The apartment Marcus and Sarah had bought 3 years ago had seemed like such a triumph. 2 bedrooms with actual closets, renovated kitchen, hardwood floors that gleamed, windows overlooking tree-lined streets. They had furnished it carefully, creating a space that felt both elegant and lived in, a home rather than just a showcase. And Marcus had felt such pride every time he walked through the door. Now, sitting at their dining room table with Sarah across from him, her surgeon's hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, Marcus laid out everything that had happened, showing her on his personal laptop the documentation he'd photographed before the guards confiscated his work devices. Sarah listened with intense focus, her dark eyes never leaving his face, and he could see her brilliant mind working through the implications. When he finished, silence stretched between them, and Marcus felt a terror deeper than anything in William's conference room, because this was the moment when Sarah would decide whether she believed him, whether she trusted him, whether their marriage was strong enough to withstand what was coming. Finally, she reached across the table and took his hand, her grip strong and steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. "I believe you," she said, her voice absolutely certain. "I know you. I know your character and your ethics, and I know you would never do what they're claiming, which means someone has gone to enormous trouble to make it appear that you did, and the question now is why, and how we prove the truth." Over the next several days, Marcus began to understand the full extent of the trap laid for him. The story of his termination leaked to the financial press despite William's promise of discretion, and articles began appearing with headlines that made his stomach turn. Rothman and Associates partner terminated over unauthorized trades, SEC investigating former Rothman partner for securities fraud, rising stars fall, how Marcus Chen lost everything through greed. The articles painted him as the worst Wall Street stereotype, a young, ambitious trader who got greedy, who started making increasingly risky bets to generate bigger bonuses, who believed himself smarter than the compliance systems designed to catch exactly this behavior. The narrative was clear, compelling, and completely false, but Marcus knew from his years in the industry how impossible it would be to counter once established in the public consciousness. His lawyers, criminal defense attorneys who specialized in securities fraud and charged hourly rates that would quickly deplete his savings, told him the situation was extraordinarily difficult because the digital evidence was, on its face, conclusive. The problem, explained Robert Hastings, a former federal prosecutor with 30 years of experience, is that proving you didn't make these trades requires proving that someone else did, and that means establishing who had access to your credentials, how they obtained them, and why they would frame you, and none of that is going to be easy. Marcus spent his days attempting to reconstruct what had happened, going through his personal records, trying to identify patterns or moments when someone might have compromised his security credentials, and he began to see a subtle pattern of manipulation that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of his routines. There had been times when Daniel had borrowed his laptop briefly, occasions when Marcus had logged into the firm's systems from home while troubleshooting with Daniel, moments when his security token had mysteriously required resetting after what IT described as a software glitch. Each incident, viewed in isolation, had seemed innocent, but viewed collectively, they formed a clear picture of someone systematically gathering the pieces needed to access his accounts, to mimic his digital patterns, to create a perfect replica of his professional identity that could be used to execute trades that would eventually be attributed to him. But understanding how he'd been framed and proving it to federal prosecutors were entirely different challenges, and as weeks turned into months, Marcus found himself trapped in a nightmare of legal proceedings, SEC investigations, and mounting legal bills that consumed their savings with terrifying speed. Sarah continued working at the hospital, her salary keeping them afloat, but Marcus could see the strain in her eyes the night she came home exhausted to find him still searching for evidence. The SEC investigation dragged on with bureaucratic slowness, and Marcus came to realize that Rothman & Associates was being remarkably uncooperative with requests that might reveal how their internal security had been compromised, claiming such disclosure would expose proprietary trading systems. William himself was never deposed, his lawyers successfully arguing he had no direct knowledge of the specific trades. Meanwhile, Daniel had been promoted to senior partner, taking over Marcus's client accounts and position, and according to contacts who would still speak to Marcus off the record, Daniel was thriving, making profitable trades, bringing in new clients, becoming increasingly close to William in ways that suggested their relationship ran deeper than just professional mentorship. 6 months after his termination, on a gray afternoon in March, Marcus received news that felt like the final nail in his coffin. The SEC had concluded its investigation and was recommending that the Department of Justice pursue criminal charges for securities fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to federal investigators. The charges carried potential prison sentences totaling up to 20 years, and his lawyer told him their best option might be to negotiate a plea deal. That night, Marcus sat with Sarah on their couch, the television off, the city lights creating patterns on the walls, and he said, his voice raw with exhaustion, "Maybe I should take the plea. Maybe this is the best we can hope for, because continuing to fight is destroying us financially and emotionally." Sarah turned to face him fully, her hands taking his face between them, forcing him to meet her eyes. "No, absolutely not," she said, her voice fierce with intensity. "You will not plead guilty to crimes you didn't commit. You will not let them destroy your integrity on top of everything else they've taken. And if we have to sell this apartment, if we have to move in with my parents, if we have to spend every last penny, we will keep fighting, because the moment you accept their narrative is the moment we truly lose everything." Sarah's refusal to let him give up became the foundation for what happened next. In the weeks following that conversation, Marcus began to approach his situation with a new mindset. He stopped thinking like someone defending himself and started thinking like someone conducting an offensive operation, a hunter rather than prey. He began by making a list of everything he knew and everything he needed to know: who had framed him, why they had done it, how they had accomplished it, and most importantly, what evidence existed that could prove his innocence and their guilt. Marcus started researching Rothman & Associates' recent history, using his personal contacts in the industry, and slowly, a picture began to emerge suggesting the firm was not in nearly as solid a financial position as its public face suggested. There had been a series of bad bets over the past 2 years, investments in emerging markets that had gone south, and there were whispers of internal conflict over the firm's direction. One former Rothman associate, Jennifer Martinez, met Marcus at a wine bar in the East Village, and after 2 glasses of Pinot Noir had loosened her professional discretion, she told him something that made several puzzle pieces click into place. William was panicking about the firm's performance. Jennifer said, her voice low, and he was looking for someone to blame, someone whose departure could be framed as the cause of the losses rather than his own bad decisions, and he needed someone senior enough that it would be believable, but not so senior that they had enough political capital to fight back effectively. Marcus felt something cold and clear settling into his understanding. He had been selected as a scapegoat, carefully chosen for maximum plausibility and minimum resistance, and the $17 million in losses attributed to his fictional trades probably represented actual losses from William's own decisions that needed to be explained to the other partners and major clients. Daniel's betrayal wasn't personal. It was opportunistic, the action of a man who saw a chance to advance by aligning with power and was willing to destroy a friend to do so. But understanding the motive wasn't enough. Marcus needed evidence, needed documentation, needed something that would prove conclusively what had happened, and that was going to require accessing information behind Rothman and Associates' firewalls, information Marcus no longer had any legal right to access. Through contacts in the cybersecurity community, Marcus found someone willing to help him, for a price that consumed a significant chunk of what remained of his savings. The hacker, who went by Cypher and whom Marcus never met in person, explained that getting into Rothman and Associates systems would be extraordinarily difficult, but there might be another way, through Daniel's personal devices, which would likely have less sophisticated security. The plan Cypher proposed was technically complex but conceptually simple. They would need physical access to Daniel's phone or laptop long enough to install monitoring software that would allow remote access to emails, messages, and documents. This would require Marcus to get close to Daniel, to create an opportunity for access, to essentially engineer a situation where the betrayer let down his guard. The opportunity came at an industry conference in Boston in late April. Daniel would be there representing Rothman and Associates, and Marcus, despite his damaged reputation, still had connections who could get him into some of the events. Marcus arrived in Boston on a rainy Thursday morning and spent the first day observing, identifying which events Daniel would attend, and he felt a strange combination of nervousness and excitement, the sense of finally taking concrete action after months of passive suffering. That evening, there was a reception hosted by one of the major investment banks, all exposed brick and dramatic lighting and waiters circulating with champagne. Marcus positioned himself where Daniel would eventually see him, and when their eyes met across the room, Marcus saw Daniel's expression flicker through several emotions: surprise, guilt, calculation, before settling into a mask of concern. Daniel approached, and his opening words were exactly what Marcus had anticipated. "Marcus, I didn't expect to see you here. How are you holding up? I know this whole situation has been incredibly difficult. I want you to know that I take no pleasure in any of it, but I had a fiduciary responsibility to the firm." Marcus let him speak, nodded at the appropriate moments, and then said, his voice carefully modulated to sound defeated rather than dangerous, "I understand, Daniel, I really do. And honestly, part why I came was hoping I might run into you, because I've been thinking that maybe it's time to accept reality and move forward, and I wanted to clear the air between us if that's possible." They talked for perhaps 20 minutes, and Marcus played his part perfectly, remorseful enough to seem genuine, defeated enough to seem harmless, nostalgic about their friendship in a way that made Daniel visibly relax. Daniel had a few drinks, more than he probably should have, and he became expansive, talking about his new responsibilities, and Marcus listened and waited for his moment. When Daniel excused himself to use the restroom, leaving his phone face down on the windowsill where they'd been standing, Marcus had perhaps 45 seconds, and he acted with calm precision, picking up Daniel's phone, connecting the small device Cypher had provided, and initiating the software installation. Marcus felt his heart hammering, felt every second stretching into eternity as he watched the progress bar, and with perhaps 5 seconds to spare, the process completed, and he disconnected the device, set Daniel's phone back exactly where it had been, and turned to look out the window as though he'd simply been enjoying the view. The monitoring software began transmitting data within hours, And over the next several days, Marcus found himself in possession of more information than he'd anticipated: emails, text messages, calendar appointments, even voice recordings, and he realized that Daniel had been remarkably careless about his own digital security. There were emails between Daniel and William that dated back more than a year, discussing in careful but unmistakable language the problem of the firm's declining performance and the need to find a solution. One email from William to Daniel, sent late on a Friday night when William had presumably been drinking, stated explicitly, "We need a fall guy, someone senior enough to be credible but expendable. And I think our boy Marcus fits the profile perfectly. Brilliant but naive, ambitious but lacking the family connections that would make him untouchable. And most importantly, he trusts you completely." There were text messages between Daniel and Patricia Vanderbilt revealing that Patricia had been instrumental in creating the false documentation, using her access to the firm's trading systems to construct records that would withstand initial scrutiny. Patricia's motivation was a promised equity stake in a new fund William was planning to launch. But perhaps most damning were voice recordings from calls between Daniel and William in the weeks after Marcus's termination. In one particularly revealing call, William said, his voice carrying casual arrogance, "The beauty of this situation is that even if Marcus somehow figures out what we did, he has no way to prove it without evidence he can't access, and his lawyers are already bleeding him dry. And within a few months, he'll be so desperate that he'll take whatever plea deal they offer, and once he pleads guilty, the whole thing is over." Marcus listened to this recording multiple times, hearing William's dismissive assessment, and he felt his rage crystallizing into something colder and more purposeful. Not just anger, but determination, not just a desire to clear his name, but a need to ensure that everyone involved faced consequences proportional to what they had done. When Marcus showed Sarah the evidence, playing selected recordings and displaying the most incriminating emails, he watched her face transform from worried exhaustion into something harder and more resolved. "This is enough to clear you legally," she said, "but it's not enough for what they deserve. Because even if they're prosecuted, people like William Rothman land on their feet. They hire the best lawyers. They serve minimal time in country club prisons. So the question is whether you want simple justice or whether you want revenge." Marcus considered her question for a long moment, thinking about everything he'd lost: his career, his reputation, his sense of security, nearly a year of his life consumed by legal proceedings and constant stress. "I want them to lose everything," he said finally, "the way I lost everything. I want them to feel the same fear and helplessness, and I want them to know, absolutely and without question, that I'm the reason it's happening." Over the next several weeks, Marcus developed a plan that was both elegant and devastating, a plan that would use the evidence he gathered not just to defend himself but to systematically dismantle the lives and careers of everyone involved in framing him. The first component was establishing unimpeachable backups of all evidence, encrypted copies stored across multiple cloud services under fake identities, physical copies in safe deposit boxes at 3 different banks, detailed summaries with authentication documentation. The second component involved quietly reaching out to other senior partners at Rothman & Associates, people whom Marcus believed had been kept in the dark about William's scheme. One partner in particular, Richard Ashford, who had been with the firm for 25 years and had a reputation for absolute integrity, was approached through someone Marcus trusted and shown selected pieces of evidence. Richard's reaction was exactly what Marcus hoped for: shock, horror, and a sense of personal betrayal that William had corrupted the firm Richard had devoted his career to building. The third component was the most complex and risky, using the evidence to reveal a broader pattern of misconduct at Rothman & Associates that would trigger investigations by multiple regulatory agencies simultaneously. Marcus had discovered references to other questionable practices, aggressive tax avoidance strategies that might cross into evasion, misrepresentations to clients, possibly even insider trading. Marcus compiled this into a comprehensive dossier, hundreds of pages of documented evidence, and prepared to deliver it simultaneously to the SEC, the IRS, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the New York State Attorney General's office, understanding that by involving multiple agencies at once, he would make it much harder for William to suppress or limit investigation scope. Working with his lawyer Robert Hastings, Marcus prepared a package focusing specifically on proving his innocence regarding the trades he'd been accused of making, including emails and recordings showing the conspiracy between William, Daniel, and Patricia, along with technical documentation explaining how his security credentials had been compromised. Robert reviewed everything carefully, his experienced eyes widening as he recognized the implications. "This is more than enough to clear you," he said. "But Marcus, we need to discuss how you obtained this evidence, because if it comes out that you hacked into Daniel's phone, it could create legal problems." Marcus had anticipated this concern. He and Cypher had worked out a narrative. They would claim Daniel had accidentally left his phone unlocked in Marcus's presence during their Boston conversation, and Marcus, seeing a brief opportunity to gather evidence proving his innocence, had quickly forwarded some emails to himself. This explanation, while perhaps not entirely credible to someone who examined it closely, was at least plausible enough that it wouldn't necessarily result in criminal charges against Marcus. The package was delivered to the federal prosecutor handling Marcus's case on a Monday morning, and the reaction was apparently immediate and dramatic. Robert received a call that same afternoon requesting an emergency meeting, and when Robert Marcus sat down with the prosecutor and several FBI agents the following day, the atmosphere was tense. The lead prosecutor, Jennifer Reeves, listened to the recordings, reviewed the emails, examined the technical documentation, and Marcus could see her expression shifting from skepticism to concern to barely suppressed anger as she realized her office had been used as a weapon against an innocent person by the very criminals they should have been investigating. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carefully controlled but her eyes blazing, "if this evidence is authentic, and pending our own verification I believe it is, then you are clearly not guilty of the charges we brought, and in fact, you appear to be the victim of an extraordinarily sophisticated conspiracy, and I want to assure you that my office takes this very seriously and will be pursuing criminal charges against everyone involved." Within 2 weeks, all charges against Marcus were formally dropped, and the U.S. Attorney's Office issued a brief statement acknowledging that new evidence had exonerated him. The news hit the financial press like a bomb, with headlines reversing the narrative. Rothman partner exonerated as evidence suggests elaborate frame. Federal prosecutors now investigating Rothman and Associates executives. But Marcus's exoneration was just the beginning of his revenge. He activated the third component of his plan, releasing the comprehensive dossier to multiple regulatory agencies simultaneously, and he also sent copies to investigative journalists at major publications. The effect was like watching a dam break, as each new revelation fed into the next, creating a cascade of scandal that overwhelmed Rothman and Associates' ability to manage the narrative. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story detailing the conspiracy, complete with quotes from emails and transcripts of phone conversations. Bloomberg published an investigation into the firm's financial performance, revealing that the losses William had blamed on Marcus's fictional trades were actually the result of risky bets William himself had made. The regulatory response was swift and comprehensive. The SEC launched a formal investigation. The FBI opened a criminal investigation. The IRS began examining tax strategies Marcus's dossier had flagged, and the New York State Attorney General announced his office was investigating possible state-level crime. Within days, Rothman and Associates was raided by federal agents who seized computers, files, and trading records, and images of FBI agents carrying boxes out of the firm's offices played on loop on financial news channels. Major clients began withdrawing accounts, moving billions to competitor firms, and the exodus accelerated when institutional investors released statements expressing concern about the allegations. The firm's other senior partners found themselves in an impossible position. Their personal wealth and professional reputations were tied to Rothman and Associates, but staying associated now meant being tainted by scandal. Several, including Richard Ashford, began quietly exploring options for leaving and potentially starting a new firm. For Daniel, the consequences arrived with brutal swiftness. Unlike William, who had decades of connections and resources, Daniel was relatively junior and expendable, and his investigation intensified. William made the calculated decision to protect himself by throwing Daniel under the bus, having his lawyers leak information suggesting Daniel had been the primary architect of the scheme. Daniel was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his home in Westchester, charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, and bail was set at $2 million. The public humiliation of the arrest and the perp walk was exactly the kind of spectacle Marcus had wanted, the visible symbol of how far Daniel had fallen. Daniel's wife, Emily, filed for divorce within days of the arrest, devastated by the betrayal and the realization that their life together had been founded on lies. Patricia Vanderbilt attempted to negotiate a cooperation agreement with prosecutors in exchange for testimony against William and Daniel, but her efforts were complicated by the fact that her involvement was so thoroughly documented that she had limited leverage. She was ultimately charged with similar crimes, though prosecutors indicated that if she provided truthful testimony, they would recommend a reduced sentence. William Rothman himself was not immediately arrested, his battalion of lawyers managing to negotiate self-surrender and bail arrangements, but the charges when finally brought were extensive and serious: securities fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, making false statements to federal investigators, and even RICO charges based on the pattern of fraudulent activity. William maintained his innocence, issuing statements claiming he had been betrayed by subordinates, but the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The civil litigation that followed was almost as devastating as the criminal cases. Once the conspiracy was publicly known, dozens of former clients and employees came forward with lawsuits, and the firm's insurance carriers refused to cover many claims on grounds that policies excluded coverage for intentional criminal acts. The legal fees and potential judgments created a financial death spiral. Rothman and Associates filed for bankruptcy protection less than 4 months after Marcus's exoneration, and the firm's assets were liquidated. William's personal fortune, estimated at over $400 million, was largely wiped out. Marcus watched all of this unfold with grim satisfaction that he recognized was probably not entirely healthy, but which felt absolutely necessary for his own sense of justice and closure. He kept detailed records of every development, every arrest, every lawsuit, every bankruptcy filing, because he wanted to look back and know that the people who had tried to destroy him had faced proportional consequences. Sarah had been his anchor through everything, never wavering in her belief in him or her willingness to sacrifice for his vindication. And Marcus knew that without her, he would probably have accepted the plea deal and spent years in prison. They had a celebration dinner the night after all charges were formally dismissed at a quiet French restaurant in Brooklyn where they'd gone on their first date, and Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To justice, to truth, and to never underestimating what you're capable of when someone you love is threatened. The criminal trials took place over the following year, and Marcus attended every day of testimony, sitting in the courtroom gallery and watching as the evidence he'd gathered was presented to juries. Daniel was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, a sentence the judge described as necessary to reflect the seriousness of his crimes and to deter others. Marcus watched as Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his expression empty and defeated, his transformation from confident young partner to convicted felon complete. Patricia received the lighter sentence of 4 years due to her cooperation, though the judge noted her involvement had been knowing and voluntary, and that she had shown concerning willingness to destroy an innocent person's life for personal gain. Her legal career was over, her license revoked, her reputation destroyed beyond rehabilitation. William's trial was the longest and most complex, his lawyers mounting a vigorous defense that attempted to shift blame to his subordinates, but the evidence was overwhelming, particularly the recorded phone conversations where William had explicitly discussed the conspiracy. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all 23 counts, and the sentencing hearing resulted in a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down in a white-collar case. The judge's statement at sentencing reflected particular outrage at how William had corrupted the legal and regulatory systems by using them as weapons against an innocent person. "Mr. Rothman," the judge said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "you held a position of trust and respect. You were looked up to as a model of success and ethical conduct, and you betrayed that trust in the most calculated and cruel way imaginable by deliberately destroying an innocent man's career and reputation to protect yourself, and this court cannot and will not treat such conduct with leniency." The question of what Marcus would do after his exoneration and the destruction of everyone who had wronged him was complicated by the fact that while he had cleared his name, the experience had fundamentally changed him in ways that made returning to his old career path seem impossible or at least undesirable. He started consulting with the SEC and FBI, helping them understand technical aspects of financial fraud and sharing insights from his experience, and he found this work satisfying in ways his previous career had never been. He also began writing, publishing articles, and eventually a book about his experience and about structural problems in finance and regulation that allowed people like William Rothman to operate with impunity for so long. The book became a bestseller, resonating with a public increasingly skeptical of Wall Street. Richard Ashford and several other partners who had left Rothman and Associates did indeed start a new firm, and they asked Marcus to join them as a founding partner, offering equity and autonomy and the promise that this firm would be built on completely different ethical foundations. After considerable thought and discussion with Sarah, Marcus accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to prove that finance could be practiced in ways that were both profitable and ethical. The new firm, named Ashford Partners to signal the clean break from the Rothman legacy, focused on sustainable and socially responsible investing. The civil lawsuit Marcus filed against William, Daniel, Patricia, and Rothman and Associates was settled for an amount confidential but reported to be in the tens of millions of dollars. And while money couldn't undo what had happened or return the year of his life consumed by fighting false charges, it did provide financial security and the ability to pursue meaningful work. Marcus and Sarah donated significant portions to organizations that provided legal defense for people accused of white-collar crimes who couldn't afford quality representation. 3 years after his exoneration, Marcus stood in the same conference room where William had fired him, though now the building housed Ashford Partners, and the space had been completely renovated to remove any trace of the previous occupant. Marcus was preparing for a meeting with a potential new client, and he felt a profound sense of having come full circle, of having not just survived but emerged stronger and more purposeful. He thought about William, now 3 years into a 15-year sentence, his health reportedly declining, his wife having divorced him, and his children having cut off contact, and Marcus tried to feel satisfaction but mostly felt empty sadness at the waste of it all. He thought about Daniel, serving his sentence upstate and reportedly having found religion, writing letters asking for forgiveness, though Marcus had not responded, not out of ongoing rage but simply because he had nothing to say. And he thought about his younger self, the ambitious analyst who had believed that success in finance was the ultimate validation, who had sacrificed so much for the approval of someone utterly unworthy of trust, and he felt compassion for that younger Marcus even as he recognized he could never be that person again, that the experience of being destroyed and having to claw his way back had fundamentally altered his understanding of what mattered. The revenge he had taken, the systematic destruction of everyone who had wronged him, had been necessary for his own sense of justice and closure, but hadn't been what healed him. That had come from Sarah's unwavering support, from finding meaningful work, from rebuilding his life according to values that went deeper than professional achievement or financial success. 5 years after William Rothman's conviction, Marcus received a letter from him, forwarded through the prison system. The letter was not an apology, not exactly, but rather a philosophical meditation on choices and consequences. William wrote, "I have spent these years trying to understand how I became the person who could do what I did to you, and I have come to realize that it was not a single decision, but rather a series of small compromises. Each one seemingly insignificant, each one making the next compromise slightly easier, until finally I found myself capable of consciously destroying an innocent person's life. And the tragedy is that even now, even after losing everything, I am not sure I truly feel the remorse I intellectually understand I should feel." Marcus showed the letter to Sarah, and they discussed it over dinner. "I think that's probably as close to honest self-reflection as someone like William is capable of," Sarah said thoughtfully, "and maybe that's enough. Maybe we can't expect people to become fundamentally different than they are just because they face consequences, and maybe justice is about protecting society and holding people accountable rather than about transformation or redemption." Marcus agreed, and he wrote a brief response to William, not forgiving him but acknowledging the letter and wishing him whatever peace he might be able to find. And he felt, in writing that response, a final letting go of the anger and need for revenge that had driven him during the worst periods. Marcus's work at Ashford Partners continued to thrive, and the firm grew into one of the most respected voices in sustainable investing, managing over $20 billion and generating returns that proved ethical investing could compete with traditional approaches while creating positive social impact. Marcus became a frequent speaker at industry conferences and congressional hearings, advocating for stronger regulation and better protection for whistleblowers and victims of fraud, and he used his story as a case study in how systems could fail and how they could be improved. Sarah's medical career also flourished, and she became the head of pediatric surgery at Mount Sinai, using her position to advocate for healthcare reform and better support for physicians. She and Marcus were featured together in a New York Times Magazine profile titled "The Couple Who Fought Back," examining how they had taken their experience of injustice and transformed it into a platform for systemic change. On the 10th anniversary of his exoneration, Marcus published a follow-up book titled "The Price of Justice: What Revenge Costs and What It Buys," a more mature and reflective examination of his experience, wrestling with whether his systematic destruction of William, Daniel, and Patricia had been necessary or whether there might have been other paths that would have achieved justice without the collateral damage. He didn't arrive at easy answers, acknowledging that revenge had given him satisfaction and closure, but also recognizing it had required him to become, temporarily, someone capable of ruthlessness. The book provoked substantial debate, with some arguing Marcus had been completely justified and others contending that true justice would have involved simply clearing his name without actively destroying his enemies. Marcus engaged with these critiques thoughtfully, arguing that in a system where powerful people could often escape accountability through wealth and connections, sometimes the only way to achieve real justice was to use their own weapons against them. But he also acknowledged there was a cost to this approach, a toll on one's own character and soul that couldn't be entirely avoided. William Rothman died in prison in his 9th year of incarceration, his heart giving out during a routine morning in the exercise yard. The news reached Marcus through his lawyer, who called to inform him that William's estate was being liquidated to satisfy remaining civil judgments. Marcus's reaction was more complex than he had anticipated, not satisfaction or joy at his enemy's demise, but rather a kind of melancholy recognition that William's story, which had seemed so triumphant for so many years, had ended in absolute failure and isolation, with even his children refusing to attend his funeral. The question Marcus wrestled with in the years after William's death was whether he bore any responsibility for that ending, whether his revenge had been a contributing factor to William's declining health and death, and whether that mattered morally or ethically if it was. His therapist suggested Marcus was taking on too much responsibility for choices William had made freely and consequences that followed naturally from William's own actions. But Marcus wasn't entirely convinced, recognizing there was a difference between legal culpability and moral responsibility. He continued his work, his advocacy, his writing, and his marriage to Sarah, and he found that as years passed, the intensity of his feelings about what had happened gradually diminished, not disappearing but becoming integrated into his sense of self in ways that no longer dominated his emotional landscape. He could go days or weeks without thinking about William or Daniel or Patricia, could focus on present challenges and future possibilities rather than past grievances, and he recognized this as a form of healing, imperfect and incomplete but real nonetheless. When young professionals in finance came to him seeking advice or mentorship, asking how to navigate ethical challenges or maintain integrity in environments that offer rewarded compromise, Marcus would tell them his story and say, "The most important thing I learned is that your reputation and your integrity are inseparable from who you actually are, not just how you appear to others. And if you compromise your ethics for success, eventually that success will be built on a foundation that will crumble, taking everything with it." 15 years after that Thursday evening when Marcus's world had shattered in William Rothman's conference room, Marcus sat in his home office in their brownstone in Brooklyn, working on his 3rd book, Beyond Revenge, Building Lives of Meaning After Betrayal. The book drew on interviews with dozens of people who had experienced major betrayals and had found ways to create meaningful lives from the wreckage. The primary theme was that people who thrived after betrayal were those who eventually stopped defining themselves by what had been done to them and started defining themselves by what they chose to do in response. That victimhood, however justified, was ultimately a limiting identity that kept people trapped in the past, while choosing to become an advocate, a reformer. An educator created a path forward that honored the pain without being consumed by it. Sarah joined him in the office, bringing 2 glasses of wine, and settling into the chair across from his desk. "Do you think about it much anymore?" Sarah asked, and Marcus knew she meant the entire ordeal. "Less than I used to," he responded, "but it's always there in some way, like a scar that's healed but that you can still feel when the weather changes. And I think what I've come to understand is that it's part of who I am now, not the defining part but an integrated part. And that's probably healthy, to acknowledge it without being consumed by it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Sarah said, "I was thinking today about how different our lives would be if none of that had happened, if William had never framed you, if you'd just continued on your trajectory at Rothman Associates, and I realized that as terrible as it was, I wouldn't want to go back and prevent it if I could, because the people we've become, the work we're doing, the relationship we have, none of that would exist in that alternate reality, in this. Life, despite all its challenges, feels more authentic and meaningful than that other life would have been." Marcus absorbed this observation, recognizing its truth even as part of him wanted to protest that surely there could have been a path to meaning that didn't require such suffering. But he also understood what Sarah was really saying, not that the suffering was good or necessary in some cosmic sense, but that they had transformed it into something valuable, had refused to let it be meaningless or purely destructive, had wrung meaning from catastrophe through sheer determination and love. "You're right," he said finally, "and I think that's what I'm trying to capture in this new book, that idea that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were before, but about building something new from the pieces, something that incorporates the fractures and the scars and the hard-won knowledge that comes from surviving betrayal, and that this can actually be stronger and more authentic than the unbroken but perhaps less examined life that came before." The years continued to pass, and Marcus and Sarah grew older together, their bodies changing but their commitment to each other and to their work undiminished, and they found new challenges and new causes, always staying engaged, always asking what they could contribute, always remembering that their comfort came with responsibilities to help others struggling as they once had. On the 20th anniversary of his exoneration, Marcus was invited to speak at Columbia Business School, and standing in front of several hundred students who reminded him so much of his younger self, ambitious, brilliant, hungry for success, he told them his story, and he concluded by saying, "What I learned, at enormous cost, is that there are some prices too high to pay for success, that compromising your ethics or betraying people who trust you or participating in systems that harm innocent people will eventually destroy you even if you appear to get away with it for a while, and that the only sustainable path to a meaningful life is to be absolutely clear about your values and to have the courage to live by them even when it costs you opportunities or advancement or the approval of people whose approval you desperately want. But I also learned that when you face injustice, when someone powerful tries to destroy you, you have more strength than you know. You can fight back. You can win. You can make them pay for what they did. And while revenge won't heal you or make you whole, it can give you the satisfaction of knowing that actions have consequences and that even the powerful aren't immune to accountability if someone is determined enough and creative enough and ruthless enough to hold them accountable. The question you'll have to answer for yourselves is what kind of person you want to be. Whether you want to be someone who uses people and systems to advance yourself regardless of cost to others, or whether you want to be someone who builds success on a foundation of integrity and genuine value creation. And I can't make that choice for you, but I can tell you that one path leads to a life you can be proud of, and the other path, even if it appears successful on the outside, leads eventually to a reckoning that will take everything from you. And the difference between those paths is determined by the small choices you make every day, the compromises you accept or reject, the lines you're willing to cross or refuse to cross. The speech was recorded and posted online, where it went viral, generating millions of views and sparking conversations across social media about ethics, revenge, justice, and redemption. Marcus's mother would have been proud of what he had become. He thought, not so much the professional success or public recognition, but the way he had faced injustice without being destroyed by it, the way he had maintained his essential decency even while pursuing ruthless revenge, the way he had built a life of meaning from the wreckage of betrayal. If you had asked me, in those terrible months when I was facing false charges and watching my life disintegrate, whether I would be willing to go through it all if I knew what the outcome would be, I don't know how I would have answered. because the suffering was so acute that it seemed unimaginable anything could justify it. But now, looking back across 3 decades, seeing the full arc of what happened and what came after, understanding how that crucible refined me and revealed capacities I didn't know I possessed and created opportunities for impact I never could have imagined in my previous life of comfortable success, I can say that while I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, I also wouldn't undo it if I could, because the person I became through surviving it and fighting back and building something new is someone I can respect and be proud of in ways my younger self, for all his achievements, never quite managed. The revenge I took was necessary for my psychological survival and sense of justice, and I don't apologize for it or regret it, because William and Daniel and Patricia deserve to face consequences for what they did, and in a system where wealthy and connected people so often escape accountability, sometimes the only way to achieve real justice is to become the instrument of it yourself. But revenge, while satisfying, doesn't heal or transform. And the real work of building a meaningful life came not from destroying my enemies, but from discovering what I wanted to create and who I wanted to become. The cost was enormous. A year consumed by legal proceedings, hundreds of thousands in legal fees, damage to my reputation, stress that probably shortened Sarah's life, and the psychological toll of becoming someone capable of ruthless calculation and strategic destruction. The gain was everything that came after. A marriage tested and strengthened beyond what most people experience, work that feels meaningful rather than just lucrative, the knowledge that I helped create systemic changes protecting others, the satisfaction of seeing justice served, and most fundamentally, a sense of self-grounded in tested integrity rather than untested assumptions. If there's a lesson in this story, it's not a simple one about good triumphing over evil, because the world is more complex than those frameworks suggest, and plenty of people like William Rothman do terrible things and get away with it, and plenty of innocent people are destroyed without ever getting the chance to fight back or be vindicated. The lesson, if there is one, is that resilience is possible even in the face of overwhelming injustice, that you are stronger than you know until you're tested, that revenge is a valid response to betrayal even if it's not the only response, and that the path forward from catastrophe requires both fighting back against those who wrong you and building something new that transcends the conflict. And so the story ends where it began, with Amon standing and looking out at a city full of ambition and greed and occasional nobility, full of people betraying and being betrayed, full of conflict that are resolved and conflicts that are merely paused. And I stand here not as the person I was then, but as the person I became through everything that followed. And I know that my story is not unique. That's happening right now to someone else, somewhere else, and I hope that my example shows that fighting back is possible, that justice can be achieved even when the system fails, that the arc of your life can bend toward meaning even when it seems to be spiraling toward destruction. The price of betrayal, I learned, is whatever the person you betrayed is capable of making you pay. The price of revenge, I learned, is whatever you're willing to sacrifice of yourself to achieve it. And the price of justice, I learned, is eternal vigilance and the willingness to be the person who acts when action is required, who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, who believes that individual choices matter and that one person, if they're determined enough and strategic enough and relentless enough, can change outcomes that seem predetermined. This is my story. This is what happens when you bet that someone will break rather than bend. This is what revenge looks like when it's executed with patience and precision and absolute determination. And this is why you should be very, very careful about who you betray, because you never know who will have the strength to fight back, the intelligence to find your vulnerabilities, and the ruthlessness to exploit them without mercy or regret. The best revenge is living well, but sometimes the second best revenge is pretty damn satisfying too. If you want to hear stories like this, do subscribe and like for more, and don't forget to tell us what you like to hear.